welcome to the latest episode of the Racing News 365.com podcast, looking back at last weekend's quite incredible British Grand Prix. From Racing News 365.com, my name is Nick Golding, and I'm joined, as always, by 2023 Young Journalist of the Year, Sam Coop, and lead editor in the back of his car, Ian Parks. Gentlemen, what a British Grand Prix. Ian, we discussed Hamilton's phenomenal victory, finally ending the winless streak in some detail in the F1 update on Sunday evening. But we've got to kickstart the podcast with the 7-time world champion on a day that he, I think all of Britain and a lot of the F1 community will never forget.
I'm actually going to kickstart this podcast by explaining why I'm sat in the back of my car, just to give our viewers and fans just an idea as to what we go through, just to give you guys our video briefings here. Basically, there's been a power cut in my house. I have no power, obviously. I've got no internet, so I've had to drive to a nearby well-known coffee establishment. And because I don't want to sit in that coffee establishment so I can talk freely to you guys, here I am, sat in the back of my car, giving this F1 update, F1 podcast a verdict. And so quickly turning to that, as we discussed in the F1 update, Nick, on Sunday night, it was just a feel-good story in many respects. And just Lewis's reaction alone, for me, tells you everything you need to know about that particular Grand Prix and the outcome, his victory, his 2.5-year wait, 946 days in total since his previous Grand Prix victory. He spoke very eloquently once he'd managed to get his emotions in check, very eloquently in the press conference, the post-race press conference. And he talked about the mental health struggles that he's gone through over this past 2.5 years, because you've got to appreciate what he's come through. He's gone from dominating Formula One, all these Grand Prix victories with Mercedes, who'd helped him win 6 of his 7 world titles. And all of a sudden, he'd gone from that position of dominance, that position of exaltation, into effectively being an also-ran in Grand Prix, to such an extent that not only was he not winning races, not winning titles, obviously, he was barely even getting on the podium. Even when he did get on the podium, it was a massive effort, bearing in mind the car that he has had in 2022 and 2023 being one that let him down, let George Russell down, let the team down as well. So even coming into this season, the way Mercedes started, it looked like after Lewis had announced he was going to Ferrari, that this was going to be a swan song season to forget. Yet here we are, 6 months in, halfway through the season, exactly 12 races down, 12 races to go, and Mercedes has managed to finally find its way on this developmental curve. Now once they've got on track, they've been able to add these magnificent upgrades to it as well. That's thrust Lewis and George back to the front, challenging for pole positions, challenging for Grand Prix victories. And then Lewis, having seen George clinch poles and a race win, finding himself now back at the top, where, as far as Mercedes boss Toto Wolff is concerned, as he pointed out, we're back. Lewis is back. And I think now, bearing in mind what we've seen this Grand Prix weekend, with the development still to come in Hungary and Belgium, Toto's confirmed post-race that there will be additional upgrades. This now could be quite a battle with Lewis, with Max, with Lando, George, Oscar, for these final 12 Grand Prix victories of this season. And it does at least look as if Lewis Hamilton will, to his credit, be going out on a high I'm not going to say that's not going to be a title. He's too far back compared to Max, but most certainly he's at least going to go out on a high as a challenger for those poles, for those additional Grand Prix victories now. But just bottom line, Silverstone yesterday was just utterly incredible. The scenes around the circuit, the outpouring of emotion, not just from Lewis, but from the fans all around the all around the racetrack, was just a sight to behold. This was a victory for the ages, one that will long live in my memory in particular. And I've attended somewhere in the region of around 280, 290 Grand Prix. That for me is one that will stand out as long as I am continuing to report on F1 and beyond.
Amazing. And Sam, you were obviously there, with Ian. What was the atmosphere like? Because through the television, it was, you could just almost, I had hairs, on the back of my neck, down my arms, just, the roar from the British crowd.
It was electric. The atmosphere was absolutely phenomenal. Even in the media pen, the mix zone, towards the end of the race, you could hear the cheers, just the atmosphere. Everything just felt so kind of. It was like an outpour of kind of tension that is kind of. It's been long coming. It's, I think, 31 months since his last Grand Prix win, which was the 2021 Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. No one could possibly have anticipated that Lewis would have to wait that long to get to 104 wins. So yeah, it was a real sense of kind of, I guess, collective relief from the crowd, and it was a really, really useful moment. And I mean, I've attended considerably fewer Grand Prix than Ian in my career, but likewise, this is going to be something that kind of long lives with me. Just how well that was received by the crowd, and also from Lewis as well. It's something we don't often see from him, and yeah, you can see just how much it meant to him.
It was so fitting as well that it was the British Grand Prix where he ended, what was a winless streak that I think none of us ever thought he would experience in his F1 career, given that he went from 2007 up until and including 2021, having won at least one race every single season. It feels fitting, Ian, that it is Silverstone where he claims this victory for Mercedes, given that there is every possibility that could be his last win for Mercedes as well.
I'm going to say on the back of that performance, I doubt it. Simply because I think we saw Lewis back to his best in harmony with the team, giving him a car in which to perform initially, but his performance in particular in mastering the mixed conditions, the going from the inters to the dry, to the inters to the dry, etc., whatever the combination was over the course of that period of time, it was Lewis at his very best. It encapsulated everything we have grown to know about Lewis Hamilton, the 7-time world champion, the 104-time Grand Prix winner. You don't have those stats against your name if you do not know what you're doing. And Lewis Hamilton, without a shadow of a doubt, throughout his entire 17-year career, has shown us that he has known what he is doing. Yes, of course, he has had the machinery in which to do it, and we can't take away what he has been given. But nevertheless, as we've seen with Max these past few years, you have to be a driver of incredible skill, of an incredibly high caliber, to then go and deliver within that machinery. Just look at this season, for argument's sake. Max and Checo have exactly the same car. Look what Max is doing in that car compared to what Checo is doing in that car. That, for me, just goes to underline what a top world-class driver can achieve no matter what. And Lewis did that yesterday. That final stint for me on those soft tyres after he'd got rid of the inters that he was on when that second big rain shower hit, it looked like a gamble at the time, particularly when you saw that Max, who pitted at exactly the same time, but obviously was naturally a few seconds further down the road, took on the hard tyre. And the question was at that time, with 15 laps to go, albeit, yes, with far less fuel in the car, could Lewis eke out the life on those soft tyres to keep Max at bay? Max very quickly made short work of Lando Norris, as we saw, who was also on the soft tyre, and we'll get to the McLaren tyre strategy in a moment. And at that stage, it looked like he was going to reel in Lewis in no short order. Lewis, however, for me, delivered one of the great stints I have seen him produce of his entire career to, as I say, eke out the life on those tyres. And to give you the ideal comment, even Red Bull advisor Helmut Marko, and we know what he has thought of Lewis in the past, if you want to go back to 2021, even he acknowledged the performance that Lewis delivered on that final stint on those soft tyres, remarking that, he knows how to master the tyres. Same for Max. He's a brilliant tyre whisperer, let's use a phrase, in terms of knowing what to do. And Lewis, for me, as I say, brilliant performance, that final stint. And that's what really clinched him the victory.
We obviously saw the emotion from Lewis after the race, both from the cool down lap and obviously on the podium as well, the celebrations with his family, with the fans. Do you think, Sam, winning the race, it suddenly dawned on him, a real moment of realization that actually it was his last British GP with Mercedes and this is his last season with them?
I think it's very difficult to say, obviously, what Lewis was feeling in that moment himself. But you're absolutely right. It's been a long road to this point, and over 12 seasons with Mercedes, the last 2.5 have been incredibly difficult. That's a fair chunk of that tenure, and the contrast between how competitive and just how strong they were for the first kind of 8 years or so, 8-9 years or so, just that juxtaposition must have been really difficult to kind of for Lewis to acquiesce with and for Mercedes to acquiesce with as well. So it's all everything's that's kind of pent up, built up over the last 2.5 years. That was the release, and I think he probably felt it was a very fitting way to end that relationship. And as you say, it may well be his last win with Mercedes. We don't know. I mean, he's got 12 more goes at it, and I'm not a betting man, but it's difficult to bet against that Mercedes at the moment. It's looking pretty strong, and Lewis has shown over the weekend he is every bit the driver that he always has been. So, I think it is a really beautiful note in which to kind of wrap up that time with Mercedes.
And of course, coming up next is the Hungarian Grand Prix, one of Lewis's favourite circuits, the Hungaroring, another venue he is very, very successful at. Is this now safe to say, though, Sam, that whilst, George's win came under fascinating circumstances in Austria, he still claimed pole position for the British Grand Prix? Lewis was on the front row. Lewis then won on merit. Toto Wolff said himself that the win on Sunday felt more justified because it was on pure pace rather than through Max and Lando colliding. Is this a real indicator now that Mercedes have overcome their troubles from the last 2.5 years and are back in genuine, not title contention, because we know they're already quite far adrift, but is this now safe to say that Mercedes, for the first time since 2021, are in contention for regular victories once again?
You'd have to say yes on balance. I think with how the season has kind of ebbed and flowed, it's very, very difficult to kind of forecast and say this package is competitive now and here in these conditions, this type of circuit, and that will translate. What we know is that traditionally, even through the contemporary ground effects era, the Mercedes W13, W14 was still pretty competitive at the Hungaroring.
Yeah.
But what we have this year is a complete change in philosophy in that Mercedes. And for a car to go very well at Silverstone and then go into the Hungaroring, they're two very, very different circuits, two very different propositions. So it's quite hard to call as to whether or not that will translate. But you've got to kind of assume they'll be there or thereabouts. As whether that can kind of continue throughout the year. Again, much depends on the development race. Is this turnaround of form that we've seen over the triple header, is that a flash in the pan? Who knows? I think it's probably not. I think they have learnt a lot, and those false dawns it looks like behind them. As for Hamilton and George and Russell's performances over the last few race weekends, they have been of a very, very high quality. They are both performing well. They're in form. You can see that. I mean, George has always been good over one lap. I think he's, arguably more comfortable at the moment than Lewis is over one lap. It's just he needs to kind of convert that into race pace now, and that's where we've seen him kind of have areas of improvement in the last few race weekends. But yeah, I think they certainly are in the hunt for poles and wins, and I think that will continue into the summer break and beyond, hopefully, for them.
And you meant, go on, Ian.
I was just going to say, look, I'll give you the bottom line to that. When Toto walked into the Mercedes motorhome, having done a range of TV interviews outside in the paddock, I was standing there ahead of where the media had been arranged to sit and to then listen to Toto, and he just came up to me, shook his hand, and he said to me, "We're back." So that was not even within the press conference environment. That was just him saying to me, "We're back." And if he's saying that, then I'm going to take him at his word. And bearing in mind as well, he confirmed within the press conference environment that there are going to be upgrades on that W15 at the Hungaroring and again at Spa. Then I think that package looks like right now it's going to be a good one for the Hungaroring as well, which, as we pointed out at the top of this, or as you pointed out at the top of this question, Nick, has always been a good one for Lewis Hamilton. I got a feeling Mercedes are going to be quite a proposition to beat at that track, bearing in mind what we've seen over these past two Grand Prix weekends. Yes, even if George did inherit the win after what happened between Lando and Max, but from what we've seen at Silverstone, and if that upgrade package, that new one for the car at the Hungaroring does work, as I say, they could be. That's going to be one hell of a three-way battle between Red Bull, McLaren, and Mercedes. And Mercedes might be a tough act to beat, as I say.
Definitely. And we need to mention, obviously, the other two British drivers. Obviously, George Russell started on pole. Very unfortunate with a water system failure. Lando Norris looked at one point like he was going to be the driver to pick up the victory. We spoke yesterday in the F1 update about Lando being so self-critical on himself, something that he's very open about to the media, and we've seen this side of him now quite a lot. Jenson Button, 2009 world champion, discussed how Lando needs to kind of stop this because it shows a weakness. And of course, you said yourself in the update, you like seeing this side of Lando. We talk about, obviously, in a recent podcast, how when you look at Lando and Max, Lando's still in his developmental phase of his career, which is why he makes some of these driver errors, because he's not quite the finished article yet, whereas obviously Verstappen has been through the phase of making mistakes and is now very much at the top of his game. Do you think for Lando, overcoming being self-critical so openly, it is almost the final big hurdle before he is very much up there as a driver who could win races week in, week out?
Yeah, because any sports person of repute, of note, they will always carry a positive mindset into whatever they're doing. I can't remember whether I've mentioned this to you before. I think I might have done, but I'll repeat it again anyway. And it references a speech I heard Roger Federer gave recently to a group of students. I wasn't there personally, don't get me wrong. It's something I've witnessed on a video. And he basically turned around and said to the students that throughout his entire career, he won 70-odd% of his matches, which is why he's one of the world's will always be remembered as one of the world's greatest tennis players. And then he asked the students, but of that 70+% win rate, how many points do you think I won? And it was a rhetorical question, but he gave it a pause. And he then turned around and said, only 54%. The reason why he won so many matches, so many trophies, on the back of a points percentage rate of 54% was the fact that as soon as 1 point had gone, whether he'd won or lost it, it was gone. And he just moved solely and singularly onto the next point and battled for that one. Once that had gone, think about the next one. Same with the game, same with the set. It was always, you just move on. And Lando arguably needs to watch that speech for a bit of motivation and to appreciate what it takes for a top sportsman. And don't get me wrong, he's starting to get there. He's that close. But yes, he does need, in my opinion, to carry more of a positive mindset into a Grand Prix, into a qualifying, even lap by lap. If he takes the Federer approach, do it lap by lap. If he's made a mistake on one particular lap, forget about it. Don't worry about it. Just move on to nailing the next lap. And then hopefully, if he manages to get into that positive mindset, forgets the negativity, stops beating himself up, then maybe he will become the world champion that we know he arguably can be.
Definitely. And the thing that's really interesting that you mentioned there is something Toto Wolff said after the race, is how Lewis had brushed aside his negative thoughts and, suddenly, was back to his best. Sam, that it wasn't really Lando, though, who made a fault in the British Grand Prix. It was a bit of a strategic nightmare for McLaren. Firstly, with Oscar Piastri and, McLaren opting against the double stack when the rain intensified and everyone suddenly boxed for intermediates, apart from Oscar, who completed an additional lap, effectively ending his hopes of a victory or even a podium. And, it was massively unfortunate for the Australian. With Lando, the bad call there was when the rain eventually stopped and the dry line appeared. They opted for a set of soft tyres rather than a set of mediums they had saved. And obviously, as we saw in the closing stages, Hamilton was able to nurse his soft tyres, whereas Lando wasn't. He pushed after Lewis. In the end, Max on his hard tyres got ahead of Lando because Lando was struggling so much on the softs. And McLaren, it feels like, just didn't really necessarily think things through correctly.
No, and I mean, it's a fairly nuanced situation because there are obviously things in that Lando could have done better.
Yeah,
he didn't do a particularly good job at keeping those soft tyres alive. Once that mistake had been made, and obviously he missed his marks in the stop. Actually, it was kind of commented that the Ferrari team pit crew were coming out just as Lando was kind of coming through the pit lane, which could have potentially distracted him somewhat. But he missed his marks, led to a 4.5 second stop. Those 2 seconds were costly, as we know, because obviously Lewis then came through, having stopped before. But yeah, Andrea Stella didn't hold back in admitting that strategically they missed the mark themselves as a team, both with Lando and with Oscar. To address Lando, he actually said that not only kind of the thinking was, in error, he kind of said there was almost overthinking.
Yeah.
There was, you give yourself, too much time, too many options to kind of assess, and they should have just trusted the initial feeling that mediums are the right way to go. It's almost you're trying to be too clever, and then you've taken it too far. But yeah, Lando, as I said, in that moment, then could have kept his softs alive. Worst comes to worst, had he been able to do that, probably a second place finish. If he was able to hold off Max, who had a very strong pace, so that would have still been difficult. We know that there are certainly overtaking opportunities around Silverstone. As for the Oscar situation, I think that's somewhat worse in my view, just because, to draw again on what Andrea Stella said on Sunday evening, the team got greedy. They didn't want to accept that we were going to have to lose time in the double stack. It was essentially, how do we get the best of both in this situation? And they made the wrong call. Oscar told me in the pen that he knew immediately it was the wrong call. He said, as soon as I went through the last couple of corners, he was like, as soon as I went past the pit exit, I was like, this is now too wet. And from that point, we saw going down the hangar straight, Lando in the background, the pit stop gap time loss had been completely eradicated over that extra lap, and it ruined Oscar's race. Obviously devastating for him. And again, yeah, the double stack was obviously the right thing to do. They didn't do that. McLaren and Stella admitted should have pushed more for that. Oscar had pushed for it, but again, ultimately, you play the team game. If your pit crew are saying stay out, you stay out, because coming into the pit and surprising them during a double stack as well, it would have been far more costly probably than it needed to be. So it was a catalogue of things that happened that kind of all added up to a less than optimal result for McLaren. But ultimately, they need to learn from this. I think the really, really positive thing, and this is something Zach Brown touched upon over the weekend, is that, well, first of all, we're in those positions. Now that we're there, that's the positive. Yes, there are things we need to do better to turn those second place finishes or third place at Silverstone into race wins. But the fact that we are there or thereabouts, that is the take home point.
And what's really interesting as well is when you then look at Red Bull, and there was contrasting fortunes in terms of the strategy on either side of the garage with Max Verstappen. They got it absolutely perfect with the timing of both pit stops, whereas with Sergio Perez, they got the timing similar to McLaren completely wrong, particularly in the opening phase of the race where Sergio Perez and Charles Leclerc both pitted when the rain first started to fall for intermediate tyres. And of course, as we all saw, it was far too early. So by the time the rain did intensify and it was too wet for slicks, both of their intermediates were completely shot to pieces. But let's talk about Red Bull, because, again, Max and Checo in completely different leagues to one another. Max wrestled the RB20 on a weekend where Red Bull were not at their best. He still finished second. He still has extended his championship lead. Whereas for Sergio Perez, for him, the damage was done by spinning at Copse Corner in Q1 and bringing out a red flag. Ian.
Yeah, it was. Here we go again. It's Sergio Perez, and the fact that for him now, his future with Red Bull, you could argue, is hanging by a thread. Christian Horner has made no bones about the fact, after recent Grand Prix, that Checo is under-delivering, underperforming. And at a time when he really went on the back of those words, and those words came after Austria, at a time when he really needed to produce something out of the bag over the British Grand Prix weekend, once again, he was found wanting. The look on Christian's face on Saturday when the cameras panned toward him while he was sat on the Pratt perch in the pit lane after Perez had beached his car in the gravel at Copse said it all for me. It was almost a look of incredulity, but almost like, oh well, it's Checo, here we go again. And then his performance in the Grand Prix, well, I mean, he qualified, well, he would have started 19th, but obviously because of Pierre Gasly's power unit penalty. So at least he got promoted one spot, but then obviously the team decided to change power unit components under Parc Fermé, so that meant a pit lane start. And from there, it was just a case of, let's see what we can do. The early tyre stop for the intermediates was a gamble, I think, on Red Bull's part, just to see, it was almost like a guinea pig for me in that respect, just to test the water that was arguably coming down, you could say. But quite naturally, it was a gamble that backfired. So it was almost like they had nothing to lose with Checo by pitting him early. Because if more rain had fallen, then he might have been in a really good position should everybody else have had to come in a lap or two later to switch their inters. Unfortunately, as I say, the rain wasn't heavy enough. The inters were chewed up, same with those on the Ferrari of Charles Leclerc. And yeah, he just drifted into anonymity. and another weekend of obscurity in many respects. And I just bring up the standings right now. He is 137 points behind Max. Over the last 6 Grand Prix, he's scored just 15 points. You guys came up with a lovely stat just before we came on that over the course of this season, in the 12 Grand Prix that we've had, he's been out-qualified by Logan Sargent in a Williams 7-5. And that in a car that Max Verstappen has produced wonders with so far, even after the early dominance of the RB20, when that car and Max has come under threat from McLaren and Lando, and he's now coming under a renewed threat from Mercedes, Lewis and George. He's still managing to produce good points that's allowing Red Bull to maintain a healthy-ish advantage over the chasing McLaren and Mercedes and Ferrari. Ferrari, we know, has faltered considerably these last few Grand Prix. But obviously, it's allowing Max to keep a strong grip on retaining his driver's title this year with 12 races to go. But Checo, if everything that is to be believed from what Sam and I have heard over the Grand Prix weekend at Silverstone, it appears now as if the Hungarian and Belgian Grand Prix, it's almost like a 2-race test to prove to Red Bull, show us what you've got. Otherwise, you might not be in that car post-summer break.
Definitely a scary situation for Perez to find himself in, because this could ultimately lead to potentially the end of his F1 career, because as we know, there are seats filling up elsewhere very, very quickly now. But you mentioned there, obviously, about Ferrari a little bit, Ian, and they've lost their way the last few rounds. Sam, Ferrari are all at sea at the moment, it seems. Carlos Sainz did get P5, Leclerc outside the points after being eliminated in Q2. As I mentioned, he was another driver who, kind of was gambled on by Ferrari and pitting early for intermediates. Too early, it turned out. Leclerc is another figure who quite clearly wears his heart on his sleeve. And the recent results since Monaco and that heroic weekend where he finally won his home race, it's clear that this is getting to Leclerc. He said himself that the current form and what is going on is worse than a nightmare. It's so strange, because for the first 6, 7 rounds, 8 rounds, really up until Monaco, it seemed like Frederic Vasseur had completely turned around Ferrari and made them a team capable of winning races consistently, potentially fighting for the championship, where all of a sudden we're starting to see these cracks we saw under Matteo Binotto reappearing almost.
Yeah, and for Charles as well, after the race, you could just see how despondent he was. It was like the life had kind of been sucked out of him a little bit, and that's when he was making those comments that you referred to, Nick, that just then. It's a real kind of when it rains, it pours, which is fitting given the weather we've had at Silverstone over the weekend. I think I want to take Canada out of the scenario slightly, because it plays into the bigger picture. Don't get me wrong, when you're talking about the previous eras, strategic blunders that have kind of become expected is maybe harsh, but a lot of people do expect those types of mistakes from the Ferrari pit wall. Yes, that is absolutely part of that bigger picture, but I think what's been really key is that is compounded by an upgrade that was brought at the start of the triple header that just hasn't worked, to the extent that they've now actually reverted back to the Imola spec. We're seeing quite often this season almost negative growth when it comes to development. And the more that you add on to the car in terms of downforce, any other kind of performance gains, the less sure teams are. And it's intriguing, really, because the teams don't seem to understand. I mean, Christian Horner said to yesterday that he kind of would be very impressed if any of the top teams could really understand the stints and the performance that was kind of ebbing and flowing throughout the race. And obviously that's a slightly different thing, but I think that's a nice sentiment to kind of apply to this. It's very, very puzzling as to what really is the crux of the issue at Ferrari. But it is really starting to adversely affect Leclerc, and you can hear that in his comments. As for where they go from here, that's very, very difficult to call. You almost need that kind of, they just need to get a solid weekend under their belt. It's this kind of, it's snowballing at this stage. You need to kind of arrest that slide. And yeah, I think there's almost not much more to say other than that they are just nowhere. They don't seem to know what's going on. The drivers don't seem to know what's going on. I mean, Carlos had a strong weekend. Let's not beat around the bush about that. Yeah. He had a really good race, but still, they wanted to be in that mix, and they've fallen adrift of that front group, which is now, as we've mentioned, Red Bull, McLaren, and Mercedes.
But what's so fascinating about that, though, is then you look at one of Ferrari's customer teams in Haas. Nico Hülkenberg in qualifying was the top Ferrari-powered driver. In P6 in the race, Hülkenberg also finished 6th. And obviously, Haas has introduced, a substantial upgrade. And weirdly, whereas Ferrari have introduced this big package in the Spanish Grand Prix, and it's just gone horribly wrong. Similar to what we saw with Aston Martin last year, where they went on an incredible run of podiums with Fernando Alonso before an upgrade just ruined their season. Haas are just getting better and better and better, with every upgrade they introduce, Ian.
Yeah, 2 6th-place finishes now for Nico Hülkenberg. Yes, the 6th place in Austria. Like discussed earlier with George, a touch fortunate because of what happened with Lando and Max, but nevertheless, you've got to be in it to win it. You've got to be there at the checkered flag, and it would have been an 8th place otherwise, which would still have been a good result for them. Yeah, obviously it proved to be 6th and 8th, didn't it, for Nico and Kevin? Yeah. It could have been 8th and 10th, but it was 6th and 8th, and a great result. And then they introduced this upgrade for the British Grand Prix, and out the box, in particular for Nico, not quite sure on Kevin's side of the garage where it quite went wrong over the course of his weekend, but for Nico especially, that in this case was a 6th place on merit. And as we say, just a brilliant performance to be quicker than the Ferraris themselves. In particular, Charles, of course, and as you just mentioned there, a nightmare shock over weekend for him. This is now a real fillip, a real tonic for Haas going forward, because they are in this fight in the lower half of the championship with Alpine, with RB, with State, with Williams. And these points over these last 2 Grand Prix now are huge for the team, absolutely huge, because not only in terms of where it might help them in terms of their finishing place and the constructors' prize money that comes with it, but also significantly as well with regard to morale within the organization itself, showing that under Ayao Komatsu's technical leadership that they are able to take these strides forward now. But also it's with regard to, as I say, its finishing position in the championship, but also now with regard to what it now knows it can do over the course of a Grand Prix weekend. These next 2 coming up, Hungaroring, Spa-Francorchamps, are going to be really fascinating for me just to see exactly where Haas is compared to its rivals. Have they really taken this giant stride forward that it seems we have seen at Silverstone, and we saw to a slightly lesser extent at Spielberg, because it didn't have the upgrade package on the car? And as I say, yes, they got both cars in the top 10. They scored great points without Lando and Max colliding. But now we've really seen what that car can do, certainly at the hands of Nico Hülkenberg. As I say, you can only hope there's more to come from Kevin over these next 2 Grand Prix, because he's also another driver under pressure with regard to his future and his seat, etc. So, as I say, these next 2 Grand Prix for me, they're going to be a really, really big indicator as to what we can expect from Haas over the second half of the season.
Definitely, it was an amazing performance by Nico Hülkenberg. But it is that time of the podcast where we need to do our biggest takeaways. And given that we are at the end of the European triple header. It's gone in a flash. I want you guys, we're all going to do a big takeaway from the British Grand Prix, but also the triple header as a whole. So I'll give you guys a few seconds to think, and I will kick us off. And I think the big takeaway from the European triple header is that I don't think in the Drivers' Championship there's any chance really of a fight. I think Max has shown that even when Red Bull are not on top, he can still get consistent podiums, which when those around him are making errors is ultimately going to get him the job done. However, in the constructors, if Sergio Perez does not improve, then I think we do have a real fight in the constructors, especially as Mercedes are now in with the fight of podiums and victories, which whilst they aren't necessarily in title contention, if Lando were to win a race, for example, that could be more places between Lando, Oscar and Max, which could have a big effect on how the points look. And for the British Grand Prix, it's got to be Lewis Hamilton returning to winning ways. It's been a long time since we've seen him on top. And I think the incredible thing we're seeing, his raw emotion, I don't think throughout his F1 career, maybe excluding his first world title or maybe the seventh, I don't think we've ever seen that level of emotion to Lewis, which shows, just how hard these last 2.5 years have been. And it very much shows that it doesn't matter how much money you've got. Some of these drivers are so, financially, well off. They are sportsmen at the end of the day, and it is their life. And going through periods of not winning, it destroys them. It has mental impacts on them. And to see him overcome that, to finish on top at the British Grand Prix, I think was just it was beautiful. Ian, we'll come to you next.
Top takeaway for me, I won't do a Toto Wolff impression this time, but you can imagine when Arnold Schwarzenegger turned around and said, "I'll be back." We've now got Toto Wolff saying, "We're back." And I firmly agree with that. I think now we are seeing Mercedes really come to the fore. I don't think it's any fluke kind of period that this team is going through. They've found, as I said, the right developmental path. After 2 years of absolute turmoil and struggle and scratching heads, they're now on it. And if these upgrade packages, as I've discussed earlier for Hungary and Belgium, also add to the mix, as opposed to taking a wrong turn, such as Ferrari has done with its upgrade package that it introduced in Spain, then again, I think looking at the next 2 Grand Prix, huge for Mercedes. If they come out of those with poles, potentially race wins, then without a shadow of a doubt, we can say they are most definitely back.
Sam, bring us home.
I think my biggest take home from the British Grand Prix, and it's a more encompassing one, but I think it really kind of was punctuated at Silverstone, is just how different the first half of the season and the second half of the season will be.
Yeah.
And I think it's one of those, you kind of touched upon it yourself, Nick, that we don't have a title fight. I think when all is said and done, it's not going to look like the second half of the season there'll be no correlation between the result and kind of actually how good I think this second half of the season is shaping up to kind of be. I think what we've really seen is that 2-class system that we had throughout the grid for the first few races that has kind of lessened somewhat. I think that's almost been shattered this weekend. You had a Haas finishing 6th. Yes, Aston, who were in that kind of original top 5 groups, they had their best weekend for a long time, but they've still got some way to go to get back into that hunt. And then you've also got Alex Albon finishing in 9th and Yuki Tsunoda in 10th. So that's half the top 10 were teams that were, really not in that kind of hunt that's now become an established top 4 with Aston falling away. I think we're going to see a lot more variety in points, less of a stranglehold than we saw in the first few races. And I think it's going to be really interesting, that battle in the midfield. Not equally necessarily in terms of what we'll see from the 5 guys at the front, being obviously the 2 Mercedes, 2 McLarens and Verstappen. But I think there is something for everyone throughout the field. And so, I think it's really, really well poised for the final 12 races.
It is going to be a thrilling second half.
I'm just going to add to that. was just going to add to that. I think Sam's correct, certainly with regard to the driver's title. I think Max just has too much about him, regardless of the car that's beneath him, even if it's not quite performing as he wants it to, and he's admitted that as well, that car's not quite there at the moment. He made that quite clear post-race after the British Grand Prix. But I just do think that regardless anyway, even if he's not getting the wins that he was accustomed to last season when he absolutely totally dominated that campaign, I just think he's always there or thereabouts. And I think he's with others, with McLaren and Mercedes taking points off one another effectively, as that's not what we're now seeing. I think Max is always going to have enough of an advantage. It's 84 points over Lando at the minute. That's 3 Grand Prix and then some, if you think about it. But in the constructors, I'm not ruling out McLaren giving Red Bull a run for its money. I think Mercedes is just a bit too far back. McLaren, it's only 78 points. And when you've got a second driver that is not performing, as Checo Perez is without doubt not performing at the minute, and you are only fighting a Constructors' Championship, as I mentioned across the weekend, with effectively one hand tied behind your back, because that's the effect that Perez has on Red Bull at the minute, then either he, A, has to produce something remarkable over these next 2 Grand Prix to get himself back to the front alongside Max, ensuring Red Bull can defend its Constructors' Championship, or Red Bull has to make the clear decision that over the summer break, it axes Perez and brings in a driver, be it Liam Lawson, Daniel Ricciardo, or Yuki Tsunoda, to at least give the team an opportunity of scoring points. I mean, look at Yuki. He finished 10th in the British Grand Prix. Not too shabby. Who Red Bull would choose out of that trio, it's an intriguing proposition only they can answer right now. But as I say, Perez has to deliver, or for me, he's gone and they bring another second driver in to support Max the way he needs to be supported.
I think, Sam, you are bang on the money. The second half of the season is going to be thrilling, which makes it fitting that Racing News 365 are giving away tickets to this season's Belgian Grand Prix. All you need to do to enter is be subscribed to this channel, racingnews365.com on YouTube. Comment below as well if you're watching this on the YouTube platform who you want to take with you and why. This has been the latest episode of the racingnews365.com podcast from Ian, Sam, and myself. We'll catch you next week for the next one. See you later.